Author 1's story seems to have a happy ending, but note that God doesn't undo all the misery that he caused. In the first chapter of Job, God lends Satan the fire of God so he can burn a number of Job's servants to death, and the rest are described as being killed by bandits at the edge of a sword. So not only do these servants die horribly, there's nothing in this supposedly happy ending with them being resurrected. So if we're to take this story seriously, even if just as a serious parable, we have to consider the point that this massacre of the servants must have left a certain number of orphans and widows and widowers in its wake. Now the first chapter also tells us that God permitted Satan to crush all of Job's children to death by sending a great wind to knock down their house. Now Job 42 verses 13 through 15 tells us that God gave Job 10 new kids and that Job's daughters are prettier this time. But I feel that most parents would agree that if our kids were crushed alive and we were then given replacement children, well, this is not something we just smile about, saying that, well, all's well that ends well. And the fact that it's portrayed as a happy ending because the replacement kids are more attractive than the originals makes the story not only weak but shallow. Now the God in the story also confesses to having an all too human fallibility when he admits there really was no point in allowing himself to be provoked by Satan. Or at least that this whimsical, wageless bet wasn't good enough reason for God to grant Satan permission to massacre all of Job's animals and children and servants. As the character called God says to the character called Satan in Job 2 verse 3, "You incited me against Job to ruin him without cause." But now, even though I'm saying author 1's story is weak and simplistic and shallow, I do agree with the general consensus that the book of Job is great literature. But that's because of the middle 40 chapters, coming from who I'm calling author 2. Now, author 2's contribution is something I would describe even as shockingly irreverent, and I'm just surprised and impressed that the Bible's editors left this book in. Because much of what Job points out in this middle section is that when you observe life honestly, that is, without censoring yourself out of fear of what the gods will think of you, or out of fear of what supposedly holy men will react, how they'll react, you can't help notice that life is unfair, and if there's a supernatural power out there, it's one that seems to be indifferent to matters of justice and suffering. And also, when it comes to the question of why there's pain and suffering, and why it's often distributed independently of how much the victim did or did not deserve this pain and suffering, note that author 2 never mentions Satan. Satan was a major character in the first 2 chapters, but is then altogether absent from the next 40. Satan just disappears without a trace. No exit story, no explanation whatsoever. And the reason for this seems to be that author 2 doesn't acknowledge the very existence of any sort of supernatural evil in the world, or at least any supernatural rival to God. And I say this because of the text of Job 9, verse 22 through 24, in which the author attributes everything, good and evil alike, to one supernatural being only. The passage reads, "Innocent or evil, it is all the same to God, for he destroys both kinds. He will laugh when calamity crushes the innocent. God blinds the eyes of judges and lets them be unfair. If not he, then who?" Now, Job has 3 friends come to visit him, supposedly to comfort him, but they just end up criticizing him because they're just so shocked and offended by Job's irreverent words about God. They tell Job that, well, because God is great and God is just, well, that must mean that God rewards only good people, punishes only wicked people. So Job's telling him that if he's suffering, well, he must be guilty of some kind of sin, even if they can't point to it. From Job 18, verse 5, "The truth remains that if you do not prosper, it is because you are wicked." Now, Job's reply to his friends that this is naive. It just doesn't describe reality. In Job 21, verses 23 through 26, Job says, "True, God destroys those who are healthy and prosperous, but God also destroys those in deep and grinding poverty who have never known anything good." Job adds that, if anything, the more common pattern is that the wicked prosper, and the righteous are the ones who end up punished, or at least they're the ones who end up suffering the most. From chapter 21, "Ask anyone who's been around, and he can tell you the truth, that the evil man is usually spared in the day of calamity and allowed to escape. God skips the wicked when he distributes his sorrows and anger." But Job also adds that there's really nothing we can do about this. Humans are in no position to tell God that he should care about justice. Here are excerpts from chapters 23, 21, and 9. Who can turn God from his purposes? Who can rebuke the supreme judge? Who dares to ask God, what are you doing? Who am I that I should try to argue with Almighty God or even reason with him? Job notes that not only is it pointless to try to reason with God, it's pointless to try to even ask God questions, because at least as a general rule, God does not speak to humans. Here are excerpts from chapters 23 and 30. Oh, that I knew where to find God, that I could go to his throne and talk with him there. But I search in vain. God hides himself. I cry to you, O God, but you don't answer me. I stand before you, and you don't bother to look. To be continued in part 3.